This is a court of law, not a family reunion. The bailiff snapped at the elderly man trying to find a seat in the back row. Sit down and stay silent, or leave. The old Marine didn't argue. He just clutched the custody papers tighter and found a corner to stand in. But 20 minutes later, when the judge noticed the medals barely visible under his old jacket, the entire courtroom would witness something they'd never forget. Welcome to True Veteran Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted from the streets of Richmond, Virginia, when Frank Martinez pulled his battered pickup truck into the courthouse parking lot. It was 7:30 a.m., and the custody hearing wasn't scheduled until 9, but Frank had learned long ago that being early was better than being sorry, especially when it came to his grandson. At 74, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had seen too much. His left knee, shattered by shrapnel in Da Nang in 1971, protested every step. His right shoulder, dislocated 3 times during his service, ached in the morning dampness. But his back remained straight, his jaw set with the kind of determination that doesn't fade with age. He wore his only suit, a dark blue affair he'd bought for his wife's funeral 5 years earlier. Underneath, barely visible at the collar, was his dress uniform shirt with its faded ribbons. Not for show, but because Maria always said it made him stand taller, and today he needed all the height he could get. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Lawyers in expensive suits checked their phones, families huddled together whispering, and court officers moved with practiced authority. Frank approached the information desk, his steps echoing against the marble floor. "Excuse me," he said quietly to the clerk behind the bulletproof glass. "I'm here for the Martinez custody hearing, courtroom 3B. The clerk, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, barely looked up. "Are you on the witness list?" "No, ma'am, I'm the grandfather." She sighed and slid a visitor's badge under the glass. "Third floor, elevators to your right. No talking during proceedings. No phones, no disruptions." Frank nodded and clipped the badge to his jacket. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than it should have, each floor number lighting up like a countdown to something he couldn't quite name. When the doors opened, he saw courtroom 3B at the end of the hall, its heavy wooden doors already drawing a small crowd. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than he'd expected. Rows of wooden benches filled the space behind a low barrier that separated the gallery from the legal proceedings. At the front, an imposing judge's bench dominated the room, flanked by the American and Virginia state flags. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Frank had arrived early enough to watch the room fill. First came the lawyers, his daughter Sarah's attorney, a young woman who looked barely old enough to drive, and across the aisle, his son-in-law's legal team, 3 men in suits that probably cost more than Frank's monthly pension. Then came the families. Sarah sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She'd lost weight since the divorce proceedings began, her face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting for your child. Behind her, Frank's sister Rosa and her husband provided what moral support they could. But it wasn't enough. Not against what sat across the aisle. Michael's family filled 2 entire rows. His parents, successful real estate developers, his siblings, all college-educated professionals. His new girlfriend, a pharmaceutical sales rep who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. They whispered among themselves with the confidence of people who'd never doubted they'd get what they wanted. Frank found a spot in the back, as far from the drama as possible. He wasn't here to interfere, just to be present, to let Sarah know she wasn't alone, to honor the promise he'd made to his late wife that family always came first. That's when the bailiff noticed him. Officer Dennis Kowalski had been working courthouse security for 12 years. He prided himself on running a tight courtroom, keeping order, making sure everyone knew who was in charge. He developed an eye for troublemakers, the angry ex-husbands, the emotional mothers, the grandparents who thought they could turn a legal proceeding into a family intervention. The old man in the back row set off every one of his internal alarms. First, there was the way he sat, too straight, too alert, like he was on guard duty. Then there were his clothes, The suit was clean but old, the kind worn by people who couldn't afford better but were trying to look respectable. And his eyes. They moved constantly, scanning the room, cataloging exits, watching everyone with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust crowded spaces. Dennis had seen enough veterans in his courtroom to recognize one. Usually, they were here on charges, bar fights, domestic disturbances, unpaid child support. They came in angry or broken, carrying their service like a chip on their shoulder or a weight around their neck. This one was different, quieter, but Dennis had learned not to take chances. As the courtroom filled and the noise level rose, Dennis noticed the old man lean forward slightly, trying to hear the conversation between Sarah and her attorney. That's when he decided to act. "Sir," Dennis said, approaching Frank's bench with his hand resting on his utility belt, "I need you to understand the rules here." Frank looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Dennis's brown ones. "Yes, sir?" "This is a court of law, not a family reunion," Dennis said, his voice carrying enough authority to make nearby conversations pause. "You sit down and stay silent, or you leave. No exceptions." Frank nodded slowly. "I understand. Do you? Because I've got a courtroom full of people here for serious business, and I won't have disruptions." "I'm just here to support my daughter," Frank said quietly. Dennis's expression didn't soften. "Then you do it silently. One sound, one movement that I don't like, and you're gone. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear." Frank settled back into his seat, his hands folded over the custody papers his daughter had given him to hold. The documents outlined the case: Sarah's fight to maintain primary custody of 8-year-old Miguel after her divorce from his father. On paper, it looked simple. In reality, it was anything but. Michael had money, connections, and a legal team that specialized in making good mothers look unfit. They'd painted Sarah as unstable, financially irresponsible, unable to provide the kind of opportunities their son deserved. They had charts showing her apartment's school district ratings, photographs of her working late at the diner where she waitressed, testimony from neighbors about the times Miguel had come home alone because Sarah was stuck at work. What they didn't have was the truth. They didn't know about the nights Sarah spent helping Miguel with homework at the kitchen table. They didn't know about the birthday parties she'd thrown on tips and overtime pay. They didn't know about the bedtime stories, the scraped knee comfort, the unconditional love that money couldn't buy. But Frank knew, and he'd driven 200 miles to make sure the judge knew too, even if all he could do was sit silently and provide moral support. The bailiff's warning had been clear enough. Frank understood the rules, but understanding rules and agreeing with them were two different things. As he watched his daughter's shoulders tremble with suppressed emotion, as he saw the smug confidence of Michael's family, as he felt the weight of his own helplessness, Frank did what Marines learn to do in impossible situations. He endured. 20 minutes into the hearing, everything changed. Judge Elizabeth Morrison had been on the bench for 15 years. She'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable: bitter divorces, custody battles that destroyed children's lives, parents who used the legal system as a weapon against each other. She prided herself on seeing through the emotions to the facts, on making decisions based on law rather than sentiment. But something about this case bothered her. The disparity was too stark, the outcome too predetermined. Michael Martinez had hired the kind of legal team that usually handled corporate mergers, not custody disputes. They'd buried Sarah's single attorney under mountains of paperwork, depositions, and expert testimony that painted a picture of maternal inadequacy. Yet Elizabeth had presided over enough of these cases to recognize performance art when she saw it. Michael's testimony rang false, too polished, too rehearsed. His family's united front felt coordinated rather than genuine, and his new girlfriend's sudden interest in becoming a stepmother seemed suspiciously timed with the custody proceedings. Sarah, on the other hand, testified with the raw honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. She admitted her financial struggles, acknowledged the challenges of single parenthood, accepted responsibility for every mistake, real or imagined. But when she talked about her son, when she described the bedtime rituals and weekend adventures and quiet moments that make up a childhood, Elizabeth heard something Michael's expensive lawyers couldn't fake: love. It was during a brief recess, as Elizabeth reviewed the financial disclosures, that she first noticed the man in the back row. He sat perfectly still while everyone else in the courtroom stretched, whispered, or checked their phones. Something about his posture caught her attention. The straight spine, the squared shoulders, the alert stillness of someone trained to wait. When court resumed and Sarah's attorney called her next witness, Elizabeth saw the man's hands tighten slightly on a folder in his lap. When Michael's lawyer made a particularly cutting remark about Sarah's living situation, she noticed the man's jaw clench almost imperceptibly. And when young Miguel, brought in briefly to answer the judge's questions, looked back toward the gallery, Elizabeth saw him give a small wave to the man in the corner. That's when she saw it. As the man shifted to wave back at the boy, his jacket fell open just enough to reveal what lay underneath. A flash of color against the white dress shirt, ribbons, faded but unmistakable. Military decorations. Elizabeth had grown up in a military family. Her father had been career Air Force, her brother served in the Marines. She knew the significance of those colors, the weight they carried, the stories they told without words. And she knew that a man who wore his dress uniform ribbons to his grandson's custody hearing was a man who understood the meaning of honor. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the legal arguments, so determined to remain impartial, that she'd missed the human drama unfolding in her own courtroom. A veteran, probably Sarah's father, sitting silently in the back row while his family's life was dissected by lawyers who'd never risked anything more valuable than a client's retainer. Elizabeth called for another brief recess. As the courtroom began to empty, she noticed the bailiff approach the veteran with his usual officious authority. She couldn't hear the conversation from her bench, but she could read body language well enough to know that Dennis was asserting his control, making sure the old man knew his place. What the bailiff didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elizabeth Morrison's father had served in Vietnam, that she'd grown up hearing stories about Marines like the one sitting quietly in her courtroom, that she understood the difference between the kind of authority that comes from a badge and the kind that comes from carrying wounded soldiers through enemy fire. When court resumed 15 minutes later, Elizabeth made a decision that would change everything. "Before we continue with closing arguments," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I'd like to address something." The lawyers looked up from their notes, confused. This wasn't standard procedure. "I've been watching this case unfold," Elizabeth continued, "and I've noticed someone who hasn't been properly recognized." Every head in the courtroom turned, trying to follow her gaze. "Sir," she said, looking directly at Frank in the back row. "The gentleman in the blue suit, would you please approach the bench?" Frank's eyes widened in confusion. He looked around, wondering if she meant someone else. "Yes, you, sir. Please come forward." Dennis started to object. "Your Honor, that man isn't." "Officer Kowalski," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice sharp with authority. "I know exactly who that man is, and I think it's time everyone else did too." Frank rose slowly from his seat, his movements careful but dignified. As he walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, every eye followed him. Sarah's face was a mixture of surprise and concern. Michael's family whispered among themselves, clearly confused by this deviation from script. When Frank reached the bench, Elizabeth stood, something judges rarely do during proceedings. The gesture wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Please state your name for the record," she said gently. Frank's voice, when it came, was steady but quiet. "Frank Martinez, Your Honor." "And what is your relationship to the parties in this case?" "I'm Sarah's father, Miguel's grandfather." Elizabeth nodded. "Mr. Martinez, I couldn't help but notice your service decorations. Would you mind telling the court about your military service?" Frank's jaw tightened slightly. He hadn't come here for recognition, hadn't wanted to make this about him. But a judge had asked a direct question, and Marines don't lie to judges. "United States Marine Corps, Your Honor. 1969 to 1973, 2 tours in Vietnam." "What was your rank when you were discharged?" "Staff Sergeant, Your Honor." "And those ribbons I can see, what do they represent?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. In the silence, you could hear the air conditioning humming, papers rustling, someone's stomach growling. Finally, he spoke. Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V Combat Action Ribbon, Vietnam Service Medal. The courtroom had gone completely still. Even the bailiff, who'd spent 20 minutes treating Frank like a potential troublemaker, stood frozen by his post. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. A Bronze Star with V. The V stood for Valor, awarded only for heroism in combat. This quiet man in the worn suit had risked his life for his country, had probably saved lives, had definitely seen things that would break lesser men. Mr. Martinez, she continued, her voice gentler now, I owe you an apology. This court owes you an apology. You served your country with distinction, and you came here today to support your family. You should never have been made to feel unwelcome in any American courtroom. She turned to address the bailiff. Officer Kowalski, I believe you spoke to Mr. Martinez earlier about courtroom behavior? Dennis's face had gone pale. Your Honor, you were just doing your job, I understand. But let me be clear about something. This man earned his right to be in this courtroom, to support his family, to be treated with respect. He didn't earn it by filing papers or paying fees. He earned it by serving his country in combat. Do we understand each other? Yes, Your Honor. Elizabeth turned back to Frank. Mr. Martinez, I have one more question for you. Frank nodded. In your opinion, based on your observations, is your daughter Sarah a good mother to Miguel? The question hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't standard legal procedure. It wasn't following the rules of evidence. But sometimes, Elizabeth had learned, the rules didn't capture the whole truth. Frank looked out at the courtroom, at his daughter sitting with tears in her eyes, at his grandson who'd been caught in the middle of a war he didn't understand, at the lawyers who'd turned his family's pain into billable hours. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd seen the difference between what matters and what doesn't. Your Honor, he said, I've seen good leaders and bad ones. I've seen people who talk about duty and people who live it. Sarah works 2 jobs to keep food on the table. She reads to Miguel every night. She taught him to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to stand up to bullies. When he's scared, he calls for his mom. When he's proud of something, she's the first person he wants to tell. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Money can buy a lot of things, Your Honor. Good schools, nice clothes, fancy vacations, but it can't buy what Miguel needs most, someone who loves him more than their own life. Sarah's got that. She's always had that. And in my experience, that's what makes the difference between raising a boy and raising a man. The silence that followed was profound. Even Michael's high-priced attorneys seemed at a loss for words. In the gallery, someone was crying softly. Not Sarah, but one of the court reporters who'd heard hundreds of testimonies, but never one that cut quite so deep. Elizabeth looked down at the custody paperwork spread across her bench. On paper, it was a complex case with financial analyses, school district comparisons, and expert testimony about child development. In reality, it was simpler than that. It was about a mother's love versus a father's pride, a grandmother's wisdom versus a new girlfriend's ambition, a family's devotion versus a lawyer's billable hours. Mr. Martinez, she said finally, thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for your honesty today. Frank nodded and began to turn back toward his seat, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. Officer Kowalski, she called out, would you please escort Mr. Bay Martinez to a seat in the front row? I think he's earned a better view of these proceedings. The bailiff, still red-faced from his earlier mistake, stepped forward immediately. Yes, Your Honor. Sir, if you'll follow me. As Frank walked toward the front of the courtroom, guided by the same man who'd threatened to throw him out 20 minutes earlier, something extraordinary happened. One by one, people began to stand. It started with an elderly man in the 3rd row, a Korean War veteran who recognized something of himself in Frank's bearing. Then a middle-aged woman whose son was serving in Afghanistan. Then a young lawyer who'd grown up in a military family. Soon, half the courtroom was on its feet, not in organized salute, but in spontaneous recognition. Frank didn't acknowledge the gesture. Marines don't grandstand, but Sarah saw the way his shoulders squared just a little more, the way his step became more sure. For the first time in months, her father looked like the man she'd grown up believing could fix anything. As Frank took his seat in the front row, directly behind Sarah's chair, Elizabeth felt something shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. The artificial tension that had dominated the proceedings, the performative conflict, the manufactured drama, had been replaced by something more real. The presence of a man who'd faced actual conflict, who'd seen real drama, had reminded everyone what actually mattered. When closing arguments resumed, Michael's lawyers seemed less confident, their prepared remarks less cutting. Sarah's attorney, inspired by Frank's quiet strength, found her voice and delivered the kind of passionate defense she'd been too intimidated to offer before. And Elizabeth, looking down from her bench at the Marine who'd served his country and the daughter who was fighting for her son, began to see the case with perfect clarity. The decision, when it came, surprised no one who'd been paying attention. Primary custody to Sarah, with generous visitation rights for Michael. The judge's reasoning was thorough, legal, and unassailable. But everyone in the courtroom knew the real turning point had come when Frank Martinez walked down that center aisle and reminded them all what honor actually looked like. Later, as the courtroom emptied and families gathered in the hallway to process what had happened, Dennis Kowalski approached Frank with obvious discomfort. "Mr. Martinez," he said, his voice much different than it had been that morning, "I owe you an apology." Frank looked at the younger man with eyes that had seen too much to hold grudges. "No need, son. You were doing your job." "I was doing my job wrong," Dennis replied. I should have known." "Should have known what? That I'm a veteran? That I served in Vietnam?" Frank shook his head. "My service doesn't make me special, officer. It just makes me responsible. Responsible to my family, to my community, to the values I swore to defend. Today, I was being responsible to my grandson." Dennis nodded, still struggling with his mistake. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" Frank considered this for a moment, then smiled. The first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. "Next time you see an old man in a courtroom, maybe just remember that everyone's fighting a battle you can't see. Some of us have been fighting those battles longer than others." As Frank walked toward the courthouse exit, his arm around Sarah's shoulders and his grandson's small hand in his, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of a job well done. Not because he'd won anything, not because he'd been recognized or thanked, but because he'd kept a promise. To his late wife, to his daughter, to himself. Outside, the afternoon sun had burned off the morning fog. The air was warm and clear, full of possibility. Miguel looked up at his grandfather with the kind of adoration reserved for heroes. "Grandpa," the boy said, "why did everyone stand up when you walked to the front?" Frank stopped walking and knelt down so he was eye level with his grandson. Around them, the courthouse steps bustled with the usual activity, lawyers hurrying to their next appointments, families processing their own legal dramas, the everyday machinery of justice grinding on. "Sometimes, Miguel," Frank said carefully, "people stand up not because they have to, but because they want to, because they recognize something in someone else that reminds them of what's good in the world." "Like what?" Frank thought about all the easy answers he could give, about military service, about sacrifice, about duty to country. But looking into his grandson's 8-year-old eyes, he realized the truth was simpler and more complex than any of that. Like the fact that your mom fought for you today. Like the fact that even when things get hard, we don't give up on the people we love. Like the fact that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing to do, but we do it anyway. Miguel nodded solemnly, not understanding everything but sensing the weight of it. "Will you teach me to be like that, Grandpa?" Frank Martinez, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired, pulled his grandson close and made another promise he intended to keep. "Every day, son. Every single day." Behind them, through the courthouse windows, Judge Elizabeth Morrison finished her paperwork and prepared for her next case. But she kept thinking about the morning's proceedings, about the quiet dignity of the man in the worn suit, about the reminder that justice isn't just about law. It's about seeing clearly, acting fairly, and recognizing that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that don't make it into the official record. In her 15 years on the bench, she'd made thousands of decisions. but she knew she'd remember this one differently. Not because of the legal precedent it set, not because of its complexity or controversy, but because of the moment when a courtroom full of strangers stood up for a man who'd never asked them to. Some cases you decide based on the law, others you decide based on justice, and sometimes, if you're lucky, those two things turn out to be the same. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.